Have you noticed that whenever difficulty in a game, including but not limited to Final Fantasy XIV, is discussed online, the conversation has a strong tendency to call it brain-dead if it isn't outright difficult? In fact, I personally noticed this even with things that are generally considered challenging, where if someone or a group of people found it relatively manageable, that suddenly everyone has to call it brain-dead. The way I see this is that Nuance seems to be either dead or dying in many places on the internet. But let's talk about that. Welcome to the internet. We really like to sensationalize and exaggerate things. Everything has to be the greatest thing ever or the worst thing possible, because otherwise, who cares, right? Mid is uninteresting. So, once upon a time, things were either easy, medium, or hard. More difficulty settings were added, but ultimately, for the average player, what you typically need is the quote-unquote intended difficulty experience, medium, possibly an easier difficulty for those that require it, and a harder difficulty for those that want to be challenged. Unless very hard goes completely beyond what is reasonable, there is usually no point in hard difficulty's existence, as those that wanted a challenge would pick the greatest challenge anyway. The set-in-stone difficulty settings of games do not directly relate to the concept of what we call easy or hard, but the way we approach these games do shine a light on it. Both sides of this difficulty spectrum seem to have moved in different ways. Notably, hard difficulties have of course stayed around. A lot of the time, games that are considered actually hard tend to just have the one difficulty, and your only option is to figure it out, or get good, or lock in, or what have you, and get it done. For the easier difficulty, I'd argue that some games that have easy difficulty settings sometimes completely trivialize the game on that difficulty. One could say that games have gotten really good at delivering both the hard game experience and the easy game experience. The kind of player that wants the hard experience almost certainly has a very high threshold for what they would consider too hard, which means most games, for them, can boil down to: was it fun? And also, was it challenging enough? Which both boil down to yes or no questions. This technically also applies to the player that wants the easy experience, but typically, I'd imagine, they are not nearly as caught up in whether the experience was challenging enough. This then evolves into online discourse about games and content in games. It seems like games being easy is often considered an outright negative trait to many. At the same time, one could argue a guide for a game or otherwise teaching you something being easy is considered a good thing. These two oddly opposing factors then supercharge each other. You make an easy to understand guide for something, call it easy. Someone else makes what they believe is an even easier to understand guide, they call it very easy. Then you update yours calling it super duper easy, and they call theirs trivial. You call yours turbo simple, theirs quote unquote basically solves itself. And then you call yours brain dead. How do you make something simpler than that? You don't even need a brain for it. It's the absolute zero of difficulty. But then, the discourse for discussing how challenging things are in games, which also tends to jump into hyperbole and exaggeration, picks this up, and now anything that isn't meeting at least a clear medium difficulty or above, if even that, is considered brain dead. To jump back into Final Fantasy XIV specifics a bit, this is also how extreme hyperbole statements like jobs that deal slightly less damage than the rest being explained as doing so little damage that they actually heal the enemy instead. This has both been stated about Summoner and Machinist, but somehow, typically, not about the other jobs within their damage range. Strange, right? And, while we're on the topic of listing jobs, here's the list of all the jobs I have been told by one or more players is brain dead in some way or another. And just for reference, here's the jobs I have not quite heard this sentiment for quite yet. And just for clarification, here are the ones where I've gotten a more mixed "it's Braindead, it's not" response for. I am almost certain that some of you will see the Braindead list and say that one or more of those jobs are definitely not Braindead. And that's the point. How do we discuss the nuances of things if everything that is even remotely intuitive is dumped in the Braindead bucket? And just to be clear, I'm not here defending the designs of the jobs, I'm simply saying that personally I don't think these jobs are outright Braindead, right? In my opinion, a good job design is if it has a relatively intuitive baseline playstyle and then has room for some tricks you can optimize with, some depth, which I do think most of the jobs have, although not nearly as much as maybe they might have had in the past. What often makes difficulty hard to discuss in games, ironically, is that we all approach games from different starting points. Some have no gaming experience prior, some have loads, some have never played that type of game before, some exclusively play this kind of game, some have barely used a console or a PC for much beyond the absolute minimum, and some spent most of their waking moments in front of one. It becomes even more complicated as, a lot of the time, a game, for good reason, opens with an easier part of the game and then gradually ramps up the difficulty to match with your skill as you progress. Because difficulty is complicated and often games try to do different things to mix up the experience and add variety, for one player a particular encounter might be much harder than for another player, simply because different players find different things difficult. Sometimes, a game can also reach a point where it becomes, ironically, difficult to make it more difficult without the game just being outright unfair. This can quickly enable players to overtake the game by becoming more skilled at the game than the game's difficulty can possibly match in a fair way. Other times, a game might allow itself to reach this unfair state because there are ways for the player to equally match it by grinding or something, or alternatively it just doesn't care. But that is perhaps another story. Because of the way an MMO like Final Fantasy XIV is designed to allow newer players to properly on board, they can't just make every expansion, from start to finish, entirely harder than the last without alienating a lot of potential players. Sometimes, what makes a fight actually hard is the learning curve of it. Right when Dawntrail released, a lot of players praised the leveling dungeons for being a proper challenge. But once players got some high item level gear and, more importantly, mastered the fights, that sentiment changed a lot. On the other side, there were also players that hated how difficult these dungeons were. Some players even stated they outright refused to do these dungeons more than once and would rather leave if they get served these dungeons in, for instance, a leveling roulette. Personally, I feel the leveling dungeons of Dawntrail are at a reasonable difficulty level, but I also recognize they became easier once I became better acquainted with the fights. But there's a very good reason for that. A good piece of repeatable party content in a game like Final Fantasy XIV should, in my opinion, be difficult to learn, but either easy or at least not too hard to master. When a boss fight is easy to learn, it feels like a pushover, and is likely unsatisfying to overcome. When it is hard to master, I would say, is when, as you keep re-clearing it, it overstays its welcome. Learning the fight is enough to beat it, but beating it consistently? That is probably more like mastery. If we assume the leveling dungeon bosses are designed with this logic, that they should be challenging to learn but easy to master, then your first go at the boss is probably a lot harder, nuance, depending on your skill level, than it will ever be on your second, third or beyond goes at it. And if this is the case, that would explain why new content tends to start out with people saying it is challenging, and then later down the line, flip-flop and call it not hard, or telling you that you just have to log in. In a multiplayer game like this, I think it is a good thing if once you've learned and overcome a hard fight, the rematch is more manageable. Because if there is something that can be exhausting, it can be if you wipe again for the 15th time on this fight you have beaten, specifically because Peter Party Finder over there still didn't quite get it. This is a lot easier to handle in a single player game where mastering a fight comes down to just you. Another perspective to this conversation is also the fact that new raid tiers often have their difficulty gauged by how long it took the world's first racers to beat it. Sure, in a way, that represents data to showcase how quickly the mechanics are learned and understood, and how fast a team can overcome the fight. However, when compared to older content in a game, or even just different games altogether, some things are often forgotten or left unsaid. For example, it wasn't until around Stormblood that Final Fantasy XIV really decided to start being consistent with markers for fights. By being consistent and indicating tendencies, it makes it much easier to understand a mechanic much more quickly. Indeed, at some point, boss fights became somewhat formulaic in a way that if you compare a Coils of Bahamut boss fight with, say, a Stormblood boss fight, even at their craziest, most of the Stormblood raid bosses play at a cast thing happens kind of style, somewhat on rails. For the most part, the bosses play on a set timeline, and at most will skip something if you hurt them too much, but usually will simply go through the sequence. For a Realm Reborn bosses, raid or trial, bosses have a tendency to be dictated by health thresholds in addition to their timelines, which may or may not be there, which adds to a much more chaotic and somewhat unpredictable sequence. A strange example of this is Ultima Weapon Extreme, which cycles through various mechanics as their HP drops, which causes the first half of the fight to be super frantic, and then there's the orbs. If you slow down your damage, each mechanic happens at a more reasonable pace. What I'm getting at is that a Realm Reborn and Heavensward played with a much more chaotic and unpredictable rule set, which was also amplified by mechanics being poorly explained, and markers often being unclear. Meanwhile, by Dawntrail, almost any Savage boss in a raid tier can have nearly every single mechanic they have be deconstructed to be a mechanic from a previous raid tier, just with some salt on it. Black Cat Squad Crossing, well, we already saw something similar to that in P4S. Dancing Green's Arcady Night Fever with the Kone Wheeze is a slightly different take on P6's Hegemony's Pathogenic Cells, although Arcady Night Fever does not tell you the order. But then again, Pathogenic Cells is effectively similar to Diamond Weapon Extreme's Flood Ray, so you see where I'm going with this. The game got better at telling us what it is doing, and we got better at interpreting what it is doing. So even if the game got harder, we might not really notice if we improved with it. Additionally, going back to the world first race part, a little story. Someone really close to me is a window cleaner. What he does, or who he is not super important to the story. However, a long time ago, he randomly told me something to the effect of, "It is incredible that I get paid to do such an easy job." Sure, window cleaning might not actually be that hard to do, but doing it well is not super easy either. He gets it done in a fraction of the time it would take me, and he does a much better job at doing it. He knows just how to get it done. But because of his incredible mastery of this task, it seems trivial to him. Anyone should be able to do this. If we weigh the difficulty of content in a game solely by how challenging groups of players that effectively made it their job to do it find it, then most things in games in general will always be easy. And these players are only going to get better at it. Now, I'm not saying whether Final Fantasy XIV is a hard or easy game. What I am saying is that it feels like we're losing all nuance in a pursuit of saying something more extreme than the last. And if everything is Braindead, then what does that even mean? And what is most concerning about this is that a lot of these extreme exaggerations, more often than not, seems to be something a lot of people might simply be parroting because someone else said it. A particular example being the suggestion that Machinist is weak and sucks. However, in your average group, Machinist is perfectly capable, and in fact, in more casual groups, is likely to outperform other, otherwise stronger jobs. A lot of the time, when I explain this nuance to someone saying Machinist sucks, they don't have any response, because their evidence to Machinist being bad was someone else saying so with no proper evidence beyond memes lol. But it is popular to dunk on Machinist, and a lot of the people that do don't care about evidence to the contrary, as their horse is mostly in this race for the memes. And agreeing with them is easier if you want to fit in with a group. If it becomes popular to call a specific boss fight Braindead easy, then saying otherwise could be interpreted as showing weakness. Surely it is easy for you too, right? Because you're a hardcore gamer, right? It is actually wild how many times I've had someone say something is turbo baby mode easy, only for me to say, actually I find this part of it pretty difficult, and then they say, yeah, that part is tough. As if the observation that weakness is acceptable changes the whole conversation. So to conclude a bit on this discussion, hopefully the observation that we seem to be exaggerating everything to an extreme when Nuance is completely lost could help us a bit to regain some of it when discussing games, not just Final Fantasy XIV. You know, be the change you want to see, right? But what do you think? Do you think I'm overanalyzing something that is merely a joke, quote unquote? Because if you do, I want to quickly step in and let you know that too many people take these statements of things being brain dead at face value. Just because you know it's a joke doesn't mean they do. Maybe you feel that the assessment that these things are indeed all brain dead or whatever is actually accurate. Or maybe you also feel like Nuance is getting lost. Whatever the case, I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Paladin's Endwalker rework that allegedly made it brain dead by losing a dot to manage, the job optimally played with either a 1-minute looping rotation or on slower GCDs a 2-minute looping rotation. The true nuance here was that the job was much more heavily punished for losing uptime whatsoever, but compare that to now where Paladin's rotation has more variance and, played optimally, is more like a 7-minute looping rotation because it's more like a priority system. Is that more or less brain dead, or just different?